We all think Stranger Things is a fun 80s adventure.
Mm-hmm.
We cue up the synth music, we look back fondly at the bikes and the Dungeons and Dragons, and we call it a nostalgic romp. It's supposed to be this comfortable, slightly scary, Amblin-esque story about the triumph of friendship.
Right, the kind of show we watch to feel safe about the past?
Exactly what it's not.
That aesthetic, that highly specific, neon-lit, synthesizer-scored pastiche is, well, it's the defense mechanism the show wants you to look at. It's the sugar coating.
Yes.
But if you actually peer beneath that glossy surface, what we are really grappling with, and this is according to the extensive report we're deep diving into today, The Architecture of Regressed Trauma, is something profoundly, heartbreakingly darker.
I was absolutely stunned when I read the opening lines of this analysis. It just shatters the illusion immediately. This is not a feel-good adventure. It's defined in the report as a profound tragedy about child soldiers, state-sanctioned abuse, and the lethal, calcified consequences of suppressed grief. The whole narrative, we're told, is an indictment of the adult world. It illustrates the systematic weaponization of children by the very system that should be protecting them.
And that is our mission today. To, in a way, perform a psychological autopsy on Hawkins, Indiana. We're synthesizing child psychology, Cold War history, and even some pretty complex film criticism to really understand the true nature of this war.
And the core thesis of the report is intentionally unsettling, but it's critical. The supernatural threats, the Demogorgon, the Mind Flayer, Vecna, they are not simple sci-fi aliens. They're not extraterrestrial invaders just dropped into the American Midwest.
No, that's the key mistake most viewers make.
They are, and this is the phrase that just stuck with me. Indigenous manifestations of human failure, they grew there.
Exactly. They are the monstrous shadow selves of a town, a government, and a culture that sacrificed its young on the altar of, geopolitical supremacy, scientific hubris, and suburban conformity. The analysis argues that if the state creates a wound, the dimension opens to fill it. So today, we're going to dissect this analysis across 4 crucial strata. First, the very real and devastating MKUltra connection, which is where all the abuse began. Then, the upside down is the actual topography of PTSD, a place literally frozen in time.
That part blew my mind.
It's incredible. Then Vecna, as the anthropomorphism of suicidal ideation and depression. And finally, we'll look at the profound sociological critique embedded within that nostalgia trap itself.
Okay, let's unpack this foundational sin, because everything that happens, every single monster that escapes, it all flows directly from the actions of the adult world and, well, the primary architect of trauma, Dr. Martin Brenner, Papa.
Right.
We have to analyze him not as some standard fictional villain, but as this chilling, frighteningly real representation of state-sanctioned abuse.
The report draws a direct, and I'd say damning, line from the creation of the Hawkins National Laboratory to historical fact. Brenner and the lab are narrative metaphors for the very real, very covert CIA program known as Project MKUltra.
And for those who might not be familiar with the history, MKUltra wasn't some minor intelligence snafu. This was a huge deal. It was initiated in 1953, right at the height of the Cold War and all the paranoia over communist brainwashing.
Mm-hmm.
And the CIA began this terrifying spectrum of techniques designed to achieve mind control and psychological warfare. We're talking LSD experimentation, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, outright psychological torture.
And often on unwitting subjects.
Yes, often carried out on vulnerable groups like psychiatric patients, prisoners, and institutionalized children.
And the show does not handle this historical atrocity lightly. The report is very clear that it is the foundational sin of the entire Stranger Things universe. Hawkins' lab, with its sterile white walls and its brutal procedures, it isn't a university research facility. It's identified by this analysis as an industrial facility designed for manufacturing psychic ordnance.
Psychic ordnance.
That's the term they use, yeah. Officially, it's called Project Indigo in the show. The concept is truly terrifying. The government isn't just researching psychic ability. They're building weapons using children as the raw material.
I was so fascinated by the linguistic analysis applied to Eleven's upbringing. The phrase that really stuck with me is that she was not raised, she was literally manufactured.
It was a production line.
It was a production line. The traditional loss of innocence story, which is a key trope in that Amblin-style cinema, it isn't a metaphorical coming of age here. It is a literal stripping away of humanity from the very start, a deliberate act of forging a weapon for Cold War paranoia. She was defined as a tool before she was ever granted the designation of a child.
And Brenner is the man who wields that tool. Which brings us to the insidious nature of the trauma bond, or what we'd call Stockholm Syndrome, that he constructs. The analysis uses Jungian psychology to examine Brenner's persona, and it argues his shadow self, that dark, repressed, morally compromised side, has completely consumed his morality. He is sociopathic, driven solely by scientific domination and the abstract, distant goal of Cold War victory. He represents the state's willingness to, and this is devour its own young in the name of security.
And the way he devours them is through this manipulation that mimics paternal love, which is just the cruelest part.
It's so insidious.
He speaks softly, he offers these rare, measured moments of comfort, a gentle touch on the shoulder, a nod of approval. But it's all just to solidify his position as Eleven's only possible protector against the hostile world he himself created inside that laboratory.
It's the ultimate conditional love. His affection is entirely transactional. It is predicated on her utility.
Right.
When Eleven successfully crushes a soda can or spies on an enemy, she is rewarded with a small, rare sign of warmth. But failure. Failure means immediate isolation, sometimes violent restraint, or being thrown back into the dark room.
And the outcome of that dynamic is just devastating for her psychological development. 11 learns this lethal lesson. Love is transactional, and even more tragically, that safety is only granted through the successful performance of violence.
Yes.
She has to destroy something, a soda can, a monitor, a person, to earn a measure of warmth or just to survive. That is a foundational trauma that you see influencing every single action she takes, even as an adolescent.
We see the ultimate confirmation of this thesis, that trauma is the engine of the state's power in Season 4 with the Nina Project.
Oh, absolutely.
He doesn't try to heal her. He doesn't try to help her integrate her past. He deliberately forces Eleven to relive her most traumatic memories in this constant brutal loop, all to restore her powers.
It's
The
torturing.
report draws a very clear conclusion here. In the eyes of the state, a traumatized child is more useful than a healed one. A child whose powers derive from pain, rage, and self-sacrifice is viewed as a better weapon than a child who has found peace and integrated their identity.
That is truly dark. It implies that the system fundamentally believes the pain is the source of her worth, not a weakness to be cured. The only way for her to succeed is to continue being damaged.
And this dehumanization is institutionalized down to the very core of their identity. They don't have names, they have numbers. 1, 8, 11.
Right.
This stripping of identity is a classic tactic used in total institutions, prisons, concentration camps, to erase individual identity and enforce dependency on the authority figure. They're not people. They are categorized as inventory, not as individuals capable of self-determination.
And the symbol of the sensory deprivation tank becomes crucial here too. It's supposed to be a tool for unlocking consciousness, achieving some form of heightened mental state. But in the context of the lab, the analysis describes it as a terrifying perversion of the womb.
Instead of growth and safety, it's a sterile void. The child is stripped of all healthy connection to the physical world, love, human touch, to force their consciousness to search for connection somewhere else, in the dark.
And it is only in this absolute state-sanctioned isolation that 11 first makes contact with the Demogorgon and rips open the dimension.
Exactly.
The implication, then, is profound. When you strip a child of connection and force them into absolute isolation, you inevitably connect them to the darkness itself. The act of state-sponsored isolation is the key that unlocks the door to the monsters.
And we can't forget the ultimate cost of challenging this system, which we see in the fate of Eleven's mother, Terry Ives.
Oh, Terry, yeah.
She was chemically lobotomized to protect state secrets. Her looping mantra, breathe, sunflower, rainbow, 3 to the right, 4 to the left, is this haunting, shattered testament to a mind destroyed by the state.
It's just heartbreaking.
The report emphasizes this point. The children weren't just traumatized by the system. They were often never granted a safe childhood to begin with, and those who tried to reclaim them, like Terry, were simply destroyed.
And when you look at the 3 most prominent numbered children, 1, 8, and 11, we also see these distinct defining paths that trauma can force someone down depending on how they process that foundational abuse. It's like the trauma dialectic in action.
We see 3 key, fully developed trauma responses and outcomes based on the source analysis. You have the fight, the flight, in this case, the fawn, and the nihilistic rage.
So first, there's 001, Henry Creel, who embodies this concept of I guess, the narcissistic prototype.
Mhm.
His response is pure narcissistic rage and nihilism.
Yes.
He uses his trauma, his sense of being misunderstood and ostracized, not for self-reflection, but to justify destroying the world. He rejects humanity entirely, transforming himself into the ultimate predator, Vecna.
Then there's 008, Kali, the illusionist. Her response is fight and vengeance. She uses her powers to hunt and punish the perpetrators, the men in suits who abuse them. But the report points out she retains a critical sense of human connection.
Yeah, right. She has her gang.
She operates outside the law, but her actions are driven by a desire for justice and protection for her small found family. She hasn't fully succumbed to nihilism.
And finally, 011. 11 herself, the weapon. Her initial conditioned response is fawn and protect, trying to please the abuser just to survive, but she eventually makes a moral divergence.
A critical one.
She chooses to use her power not for the state violence Brenner required, but to protect others, fueled by external connection and love over her internal rage. The battle between these three is the entire thesis of how foundational trauma can either forge deep human connection or absolute external destruction.
So moving from the architects of that trauma to the physical geography of pain, we have to address the upside down itself. If Hawkins' lab is the crime scene, the upside down is the resulting psychological wound mapped onto reality.
Right. It's almost always misinterpreted by viewers as just a simple parallel dimension, like a mirror world, but the psychological analysis in the report suggests it's far more specific and, frankly, devastating. It says it's the shadow self of Hawkins.
The shadow self, yeah.
A physical manifestation of the town's collective repressed trauma, its neglect, and its systemic rot.
And to really get a handle on this, we need to quickly define the Jungian shadow self. It's the dark, hidden side of our personality, composed of all the traits, emotions, and desires we repress, we deny, or we feel shame over.
So the upside down is Hawkins's collective shame, writ large.
Exactly. And the visual language reinforces this perfectly. It's a dark, decaying reflection of the town, covered in this putrescent biological webbing, and ash is perpetually falling like snow.
It evokes not just horror, but a nuclear winter, or the look of a slowly decomposing corpse. The town's secrets, the Cold War paranoia, the abuse, the neglect, they're all given physical form as mold and rot.
This landscape mirrors the internal state of severe depression and dissociation. When a traumatized mind collapses, the world loses its color and its safety. It becomes cold, hostile, and frozen. The upside down in this reading is not merely a physical place you go to, but rather a psychological state of being you fall into when the right side up world becomes unbearable.
When the trauma forces dissociation.
Precisely.
And this leads us to what the report calls the mind-blown revelation, a key piece of textual evidence that proves this psychological link. The upside down isn't evolving. It is literally permanently frozen on November 6, 1983.
The day Will Byers was first taken.
The day the primary gate was ripped open.
This detail, unearthed by Nancy Wheeler in Season 4, is the textual smoking gun. It's not just a theory. She goes to her bedroom in the upside down and finds that her diary entries stop on that exact date. Critically, her guns, which she purchased years later, are missing.
Because she hadn't bought them yet.
Time stood still. That single day is the dimension's temporal anchor.
This temporal stasis is absolutely critical because it perfectly captures the psychology of PTSD. Trauma completely disrupts the linear flow of time for the victim.
Fundamentally, yes.
For a PTSD sufferer, the horrific event, the assault, the loss, the betrayal, it's not a memory tucked safely in the past. It is a perpetual present. The victim is literally stuck in that moment, reliving the horror in a looping cycle of intrusive thoughts and emotional flashbacks.
So the upside down is therefore not just a separate dimension that happens to look like Hawkins. It is a dissociated reality, configured as a dark copy of the town, a massive, decaying monument to the exact moment that children's innocence was shattered by state failure and the supernatural entities that erupted from that failure. It's a wound that will not close.
And the key to understanding that psychological landscape is Will Byers. He's the patient zero of the intrusion, the one who survived inside the realm, and the one who maintains that lingering somatic and psychic connection to the shadow self of Hawkins.
Will's entire character arc is defined by what the report labels arrested development, triggered by trauma. While his friends move on to girlfriends, high school social dynamics, and the necessary shedding of childish things, Will clings desperately to Dungeons & Dragons and the dynamics of their pre-adolescent group.
He is the child who was taken, and when he came back, the world had just heartbreakingly moved on without him.
It's the Peter Pan syndrome applied to trauma victims. He's too old for the simple comfort of childhood, but he's too wounded, too defined by his experience, to integrate into the complicated, confusing world of adolescence.
And this leads to a truly compelling theory within the analysis about the creation of the realm itself.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
It suggests that Will himself might have influenced the shape of the Upside Down. When 11 opened the gate, the dimension was likely raw chaos. But when Will was taken, he was a frightened, sensitive child who desperately wanted to go home. He wanted his room. He wanted his sanctuary.
So the argument is that his psychic resonance, his overwhelming need for home, combined with the raw, chaotic energy of what they call Dimension X, forced it to configure itself into a twisted copy of the home he couldn't return to.
Which is a realization that hits like a ton of bricks.
Yeah.
The prisoner designed his own perpetual prison based on his distorted memory of safety.
And we see this emotional collapse played out physically in the destruction of Castle Byers in Season 3.
Yeah.
He tears down his fort, the ultimate symbol of his sanctuary and his childhood safety, because he recognizes the truth. The fort is gone, the safety is gone, and he can no longer reside in that symbol of the past. He's too traumatized to find comfort in a symbol of innocence that no longer exists for him.
The report also delves into the complex isolation Will feels, hinted at when he destroys the fort and screams at Mike, "We're not kids anymore!"
Right.
This isolation is compounded by his unspoken internal struggles, the feeling of being other that he can't yet voice. He clings to the past because, tragically, November 1983 was the last time he felt truly happy and safe with his friends before the nightmare began, and he desperately wants to go back to that point.
And his connection to the Upside Down isn't just psychic or emotional, it's profoundly somatic. He doesn't just suffer from PTSD, he embodies it.
This is where the work of Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, provides the framework for the analysis. Will feels the Mind Flayer's presence as a physical prickle on his neck, a literal physiological warning. His body remembers the trauma even when his mind tries to forget it or compartmentalize it. His body is the barometer, the early warning system for the shadow's intrusion.
And the quiet tragedy of his character just continues in Season 4, where he uses his art to express what he can't say. He paints the group fighting the dragon with Mike as the clear leader, the heart.
That painting.
It's analyzed as this tragic confession of his love and also his feeling of subservience, painting himself as the support, hiding his true complicated feelings just to maintain the safety of the group dynamic. And that silence, that repression of self, is the fertile ground where the ultimate psychological monster, Vecna, operates.
We have to transition now from the external geography of pain to the internal architecture of destruction. Because in Season 4, the entire nature of the threat shifts, doesn't it? It goes from the animalistic, almost environmental threat of the Demogorgon and the viral possession of the Mind Flayer to Vecna.
A highly individualized entity operating purely through psychological torture.
The introduction of Vecna is the show's most explicit, most devastating metaphor for severe mental illness, specifically clinical depression and suicidal ideation. The report treats this entire storyline with the gravity it absolutely deserves.
And he is not a random predator. He's a strategic, clinical hunter. He specifically targets teenagers who are already suffering from severe, often repressed, trauma, guilt, and profound self-hatred.
We see this in every single one of his victims. Max Mayfield with her survivor's guilt, Fred Benson with his guilt over the deadly car accident, Patrick McKinney with the internalized shame of home abuse. They are emotionally compromised, already at war with themselves, before Vecna even enters their minds.
His modus operandi mirrors a textbook mental health crisis. It begins with isolation. Max physically withdrawing, putting on her headphones, pushing Lucas away because she feels undeserving of connection.
And then the intrusive thoughts begin. These tormenting hallucinations confirming their worthlessness. You're the reason he died. You are a monster. He weaponizes their deepest shame against them.
Followed by the physical symptoms, crippling headaches, nosebleeds, waking nightmares, and then the countdown. The analysis refers to the Vecna clock as the chilling symbol of the crushing, inescapable anxiety of impending doom that accompanies a severe psychological crisis. You know the end is coming, and you feel utterly powerless to stop it.
And the execution. The execution is the clearest allegorical proof. Vecna doesn't roar and kill them violently. He says in this calm, almost gentle voice, "It's time for your suffering to end."
Which mirrors the distorted, catastrophic logic of suicidal ideation, where death is framed not as an end, but as a merciful relief from unbearable self-torture. He tells them they don't belong here. That's not a monster. That's the voice of acute clinical depression.
That line defines the whole metaphor for me. Vecna is the ultimate internal critic, the voice that twists the victim's reality, convincing them that they are the problem and the only solution is self-destruction. And he preys on the concept of shame, which is just so corrosive.
And no character embodies this struggle more heartbreakingly than Max Mayfield. Her season 4 arc is a devastating and I think incredibly accurate study of survivor's guilt over her abusive brother, Billy.
It's so hard to watch. Her letter to Billy and her monologue at his gravesite, they reveal this deep, deep conflict. A part of her secretly wished for his abusive presence to end, for him to be gone, for the relief of safety.
A very human way.
A human wish. And now that he is dead, having sacrificed himself, she is consumed by the crushing, unbearable guilt of that initial private thought.
And Vecna, the suicide monster, exploits this specific shame, feeding it back to her as impure poison. When he tells her, "You're just like me," he is attempting to convince her that her secret desire for relief makes her a monster, justifying her own self-destruction. He demands she embrace the void.
The escape sequence set to Kate Bush's running up that hill is, the report analyzes it as one of the most masterful psychological metaphors in modern television. It is the literal fight to choose life over destruction.
The red world of Vecna's mind is the depth of the depressive episode. The victim is completely submerged in their trauma. Her friends cannot reach her physically. They are outside the psychological space of her crisis.
You can't pull her out.
They can't. They're merely providing a lifeline, the music, the positive memories of connection, to remind her of the reality she is tethered to and that she is loved.
Max has to make the conscious, profound choice to run back to the light, back to the memory of her friends. And the music acts as a powerful grounding technique, a common tool used in therapy for PTSD and anxiety sufferers to tether themselves to the present reality and break that intrusive thought pattern.
Her survival, though tragically incomplete, is a victory of choice and connection, not brute force.
And when we look at the source of Vecna, Henry Creel, and compare him to 11, we see the true culmination of this trauma dialectic.
They were both sensitive, they were ostracized, they were subjected to Brenner's cruelty, but their choice in response to that shared trauma defines the entire conflict.
Henry's response was pure nihilism. He internalized his isolation and turned it outward as deep, raging misanthropy. He viewed humanity as a pest, imposing an unnatural structure on the world rules, time, work, family.
His trauma didn't lead him to empathy or connection. It calcified into hatred, a desire to destroy the system that hurt him and replace it with chaos.
His transformation into the lich-like Vecna is the physical manifestation of his loss of soul. He sheds his humanity and becomes this pure entity of destruction.
11, on the other hand, despite suffering worse objective torture, complete sensory deprivation, and years of total isolation, chose connection.
Her power is fueled by love. Mike, her mother, her friends. The report notes that when she finally defeats Henry in the Rainbow Room, she accesses a memory of unconditional love from her birth, whereas Henry draws his power solely from pain and sadness. That choice is the only thing that separates the weapon from the monster.
And finally, let's just quickly address the psychosomatic reality of Vecna's attacks. The physical destruction he inflicts, snapping bones, blinding eyes, levitation, is the externalization of psychological pain. He makes the invisible, unbearable pain of his victims visible and undeniable.
Exactly. Blinding is the refusal to see the truth or the future, mirroring dissociation. Broken bones are the feeling of being utterly broken inside, externalized into a grotesque reality. Levitation is the feeling of untethering from reality itself. Vecna is not just killing them, he is manifesting their specific, deepest psychological wounds. He is the indigenous monster grown from the failure of the world to nurture its young.
This intense psychological autopsy brings us full circle to the sociological critique, which is woven into the very fabric of the show's 1980s aesthetic. We need to talk about the nostalgia trap.
Okay, so we're moving into the realm of hauntology, a concept defined by the theorist Mark Fisher. I was fascinated by this application.
It fits perfectly.
Hauntology posits that the 21st century is haunted by lost futures cultural timelines that fail to materialize. Because we feel culturally incapable of imagining a new, better future, we compulsively recycle the past.
And Stranger Things is the ultimate hauntological artifact. It doesn't just take place in the 80s. It obsessively reconstructs the memory of 80s cinema, music, and fashion. And we crave that aesthetic, that simplicity, because it offers us a false safety.
We look at the neon, the bikes, the music, the suburban homes, and we feel safe. We remember a time of supposed innocence. But the show is incredibly sophisticated in how it subverts this. It systematically places horrific, reality-shattering monsters in the most sacred, protected spaces of 80s suburbia.
The home, the school, the local community center, the mall.
The mall, the Starcourt Mall in season 3 is the perfect example. It's a temple of capitalism, neon joy, and consumerism. The perfect aesthetic surface of the Reagan era. It is meant to represent the new American dream.
But what is it literally built on? A secret Russian base and a newly reopened gate to hell.
The analysis argues that the surface is shiny, bright, and nostalgic. The foundation is utterly rotten. The mall represents the hollowing out of community spaces by hyper-consumerism and the hidden rot, the Cold War terror, the systemic failure beneath the polished veneer of the American dream.
And this leads us directly back to the core cynical theme running through the entire saga. The absolute, total, and systematic failure of adult institutions to protect children, forcing those children to weaponize themselves for survival. The system fails at every single level.
We can break down the institutional failures that perpetuate the nightmare, starting with the most fundamental structure, the nuclear family.
Personified perfectly by Ted Wheeler, the archetype of disengaged fatherhood.
Oh, Ted.
He is chronically asleep in the recliner, prioritizing his dinner, functionally absent from the narrative. His neglect is its own form of permission, forcing his children, Nancy and Mike, to find protection, agency, and knowledge elsewhere, often in dangerous situations. The safe harbor of the home is neutralized by his inaction.
Then you have the explicit betrayal of the state and science, personified by Dr. Brenner, the ultimate breach of the social contract.
The predator disguised as a protector.
Exactly. Using children as raw material for state security without any moral compunction. The entire conflict originates right there.
And we see the failure of community support in the police and local government. The police institution, generally represented by Chief Powell and the skeptical officers, are initially incompetent and powerless against the real threats. It is only Hopper, who operates as a rogue agent outside the institutional rules, who achieves any results.
So the system itself, relying on standard operating procedures, is completely incapable of understanding the psychological and supernatural crisis, let alone saving the children.
And finally, the military, represented by Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan, who views the children as threats to be neutralized, confirming the state's view that a traumatized child is merely a hazard to be eliminated.
It's the brutal pragmatism of the military-industrial complex. The solution to a psychic problem is always violence and suppression, not understanding or healing. The ultimate cynical message here is that no one in power is coming to save the children. They must save themselves.
The upside down, constantly lurking beneath Hawkins' manicured lawns, is the rot beneath the American dream. The suburbia veneer is incredibly thin. The houses hide secrets, alcoholism, divorce, neglect, state-sponsored abuse. The appearance of normalcy is just a facade.
The report highlights the image of the Demogorgon in the wall in season 1 as the most potent metaphor in the series. The monster is not out in the woods or hidden in some remote facility. It is inside the walls of the home, disrupting the sanctity of the domestic space. Joyce Byers destroying her own home, smashing through the wall with an axe to reach Will, represents the necessary, painful act of dismantling the facade of domestic normalcy to confront the trauma hidden within.
The show argues that clinging to the nostalgia of the 80s is dangerous, precisely because it was a time of Cold War terror, latchkey neglect, and hidden abuse. The monsters are just the physical manifestations of the deep-seated anxieties and moral decay that the neon lights and synth scores try to hide.
Beyond the failures of specific institutions, the show uses the supernatural threats to reflect the broader sociological panics of the 1980s, which is where the analysis becomes truly sharp.
We see the pervasive paranoia of the Red Scare, conflated directly with the Mind Flayer. The presence of the Russians and the Mind Flayer's hive mind work in parallel fashion. The Mind Flayer possesses citizens, creating the flayed collective, people who look like neighbors and friends, but who are secretly part of a larger, sinister whole.
This is a direct mirror of the McCarthyist fear that defined the Cold War. The idea that the enemy looks like us, lives among us, but is secretly part of a foreign collective, losing all individualism and autonomy to the state.
The Mind Flayer plays on the Western fear of collectivism and the loss of autonomy in a terrifying way, using the suburban home as the staging ground for this subversion.
And then the Satanic Panic. Season 4 introduces Eddie Munson and the Hellfire Club specifically to tackle this phenomenon head-on.
Right. Dungeons and Dragons and heavy metal music were demonized by adults, community leaders, and parents as literal gateways to the occult and Satanism.
Eddie is ostracized not because he's a bad person, but because he is the misunderstood outcast, the freak who plays D&D and wears denim vest. The town's reaction to the Vecna murders is not to look for a supernatural entity or a government conspiracy.
No, it's to immediately blame a cult, using folklore and baseless panic to explain away the real underlying darkness. Vecna, trauma, systemic failure.
His death, sacrificing himself in the Upside Down while the town hunts him for being a devil worshiper, is a profound tragedy of prejudice.
It is. The community would rather destroy the innocent outcast than confront the terrifying fact that the darkness, the trauma, and the propensity for evil are indigenous to Hawkins itself. They prefer a comfortable lie, a satanic cult, over the unbearable truth that their own children are at war and the government failed them.
As we synthesize this incredible tragedy, the ultimate realization is that the saga does not end with the restoration of innocence, but with its final annihilation. The victory condition for these children is the hardening of their souls. They must shed their childhoods completely to defeat the monsters that the adults created.
11 has to accept her role as a soldier, balancing her deep capacity for love with her capacity for extreme necessary violence. She has to become the weapon the state intended, but wield it according to her own moral compass, fueled by her emotional truth. She can't go back to being just Jane Eyes. She's 11, the savior and the soldier.
And Will must accept the permanent mark of his trauma. The time of Castle Byers is gone. He cannot go back to that moment in November 1983. He has been fundamentally altered, and he has to learn to integrate that wounded part of himself into the present, confusing world of adolescence.
And Max, heartbreakingly, must endure physical and psychic shattering, sacrificing her own well-being just to buy time for the others. The fight against Vecna leaves her permanently altered, demonstrating that the fight against internalized depression leaves indelible scars.
The town of Hawkins is forced to face the fact that the earthquake, the merging of the Upside Down into their reality, is not a natural disaster. It is the eruption of the secrets they buried, the accumulation of all the pain, neglect, and systemic trauma of their suburbia given physical form. The secrets are now visible to everyone.
And here's where it gets really interesting, where we land on the ultimate horror of this deep dive. The ultimate horror in Stranger Things is not the Demogorgon, the Mind Flayer, or Vecna.
No.
It is the realization that the monsters are the physical manifestations of the adults' failures.
They are the inevitable consequence of a society that prioritizes state security and domestic conformity over the protection and emotional nurturing of its children. As long as adults continue to weaponize children, like Brenner,
Ignore them, like Ted Wheeler.
or abuse them, the gate will remain open. The Upside Down is fueled by adult moral decay and repression.
The final haunting idea drawn from the report is this. In a world run by Brenners and haunted by Vecnas, the only way for a child to survive is to become a weapon themselves. The loss of innocence is not a side effect of the story. It is the primary, essential weapon in the war for survival. You must let go of being a child to live.
And that, more than any synth score or bike chase, is the profound, dark truth hidden beneath the layers of 80s nostalgia. You now know that the most feared dimension is just a twisted, frozen copy of home. So if the monster is the manifestation of failure, what failure stands out most when you look at the town of Hawkins? Something to chew on the next time you hear that synth score kick in.